The coldest winter in Montana history did not kill Arthur Vance, but it completely humiliated the 50 experienced builders who had spent an entire autumn mocking his house. It was mid-December in 1847, high up in Carbon County, right along the treacherous eastern shadow of the Beartooth Mountain Range. The wind was coming down off the high granite peaks at 50 miles an hour, carrying with it a biting, razor-sharp frost that made the surrounding pine timber groan and pop like rifle fire. Standing in knee-deep snow at the edge of a cleared clearing was Gideon Thorne, a legendary 64-year-old master carpenter who had spent 40 years raising traditional log structures across the territory. Gideon was pointing a gloved finger at a strange, almost alien sight, and laughing so loudly his voice echoed across the frozen valley. What everyone was staring at looked less like a home and more like a bizarre military bunker that had lost its mind. It was a massive, half-buried steel Quonset arch-war surplus dragged up from the Army depot, completely encased and wrapped in thousands of pounds of rough, hand-stacked sandstone blocks. To the local ranchers, sawmill operators, and traditional homesteaders who had gathered at the ridge, it looked like a complete monstrosity. Gideon called it a tin oven, a metal grave, and publicly declared it the single most foolish construction project ever raised in the history of the Montana frontier. They placed bets at the local trading post that the metal roof would sweat itself into an ice cave by Christmas, rot its own mortar by January, and force its creator to freeze in his bed before the new year arrived. Arthur Vance did not bother to argue. The 34-year-old former Army combat engineer simply wiped the stinging sweat from his brow, lifted another heavy 40-pound block of river sandstone into place, and tapped it square with his wooden mallet as his breath fogged in the freezing air. Arthur did not care about frontier tradition, and he certainly did not care about the opinions of men who mistook habit for wisdom. He was not building a traditional cabin to look respectable. He was building an indestructible shield against a relentless environment. What those mocking neighbors did not understand, and what they would soon learn through bitter, freezing desperation, was that this bizarre combination of war-surplus steel, earth-burning, and heavy stone thermal mass was about to humiliate 60 years of traditional log cabin construction. When the worst Arctic blizzard in 40 years finally struck the valley, bringing temperatures that froze livestock where they stood, Arthur's strange metal and stone sanctuary held a rock-steady interior temperature of 69 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside temperatures plummeted to 32 below zero. And he accomplished it while burning less than a quarter of the firewood consumed by his neighbors. If you want to discover how real frontier ingenuity solved the deadly problem of winter survival when life truly depended on it, make sure to subscribe to our channel right now, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from today and what is the coldest temperature you have ever personally survived. Because as Arthur Vance was about to prove to the entire territory, the harshest environments always breed the brilliant solutions. To understand why Arthur Vance was willing to endure the relentless mockery of an entire valley, you first have to understand the sheer physical misery he experienced during his very first winter in Montana. In the spring of 1946, freshly discharged from the United States Army with a few $100s in his pocket, Arthur had claimed 160 acres of rocky timberland, 14 miles outside the small town of Red Lodge. Like every other homesteading veteran settling in the shadow of the mountains, he wanted to build a good life for his family. He spent his first spring and summer performing back-breaking physical labor, felling straight spruce trees, trimming logs, and raising a traditional 16 by 22-foot log cabin. He cut clean dovetail joints at the corners, laid a solid riverstone foundation, mixed clay and straw to chink every seam between the logs, and built a massive stone fireplace right in the center of the main room. By September, his house looked picture-perfect. It looked like the classic, sturdy American frontier home that every builder in the valley swore by. Then, November arrived, and the mountain air turned brutal. The first Arctic cold snap hit Carbon County during the final week of November 1946, and it instantly exposed the devastating flaws of traditional log cabin construction. On paper, thick spruce logs were supposed to insulate a home against the elements. In reality, Arthur watched in horror as his beautiful, hand-built cabin transformed into a drafty wooden sieve that bled heat faster than his fireplace could ever produce it. The temperature collapse inside the living space was relentless and predictable every single night. At 10 o'clock in the evening, after Arthur had loaded the fireplace with a massive pile of seasoned pine logs and built a roaring, white-hot fire, the temperature near the hearth would reach a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you walked just 10 feet away into the back sleeping area, the air temperature immediately plunged to 48 degrees. By 2 o'clock in the morning, as the main logs in the fireplace burned down to glowing coals, the center room temperature dropped to 42 degrees, and the air currents moving across the floor were so strong that they would cause candle flames sitting on the kitchen table to bend nearly double. By 6 o'clock in the morning, when the hearth held nothing but cold gray ash, the inside of the cabin was an absolute icebox, sitting at 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Water buckets sitting on the kitchen counter froze completely solid overnight, forming a thick 2-inch crust of ice that had to be broken with an axe handle before Arthur could boil morning coffee. Worse still, the interior faces of the spruce logs on the north wall were completely coated in a thick, shimmering layer of white frost. The physical impact on his family was heartbreaking. Arthur's wife, Clara, had to dress their 2 young daughters, 8-year-old Evelyn and 6-year-old Nora, in heavy wool winter coats, thick mittens, and heavy socks, before tucked them into bed beneath 5 layers of hand-sewn quilts. Despite the heavy blankets, both little girls woke up every morning shivering, their hands red and raw, developing a deep, rattling cough that echoed through the cold cabin for weeks on end. It was the terrifying, wet cough that every mother on the frontier feared above all else, born from months of inhaling thick wood smoke mixed with freezing night air. The physical labor required to maintain this barely livable environment was utterly crushing. Arthur spent almost every waking hour outside of his daily chores, swinging an axe in his timber lot. In December alone, he was forced to chop, haul, split, and burn 5.5 cords of wood, amounting to over 200 heavy logs every single week just to keep his family from suffering hypothermia inside their own living room. He was exhausting his body, wrecking his back, and burning through his winter timber reserves at a rate that threatened the survival of his homestead. By the end of that first winter, Arthur realized a fundamental scientific truth that the local builders were completely blind to. The problem was not the cold air outside. The problem was convective cooling. A single-wall log cabin is constantly at the mercy of mountain winds. When 50-mile-an-hour wind sweeps down off a mountain range and hits an exterior log wall, it acts like a giant thermal vacuum. It strips heat off the wood surface 20 times faster than still air ever could, pulling thermal energy straight through the timber and creating a continuous pressure differential that sucks freezing air through every microscopic crack in the chinking. Arthur realized that as long as his home was directly exposed to the sweeping mountain wind, no amount of firewood would ever keep his family warm. He needed a completely new way of thinking. The revolutionary design that Arthur Vance was planning to build in Montana did not come from an architectural textbook or a local building manual. It came from a terrifying, frozen memory forged 3 years earlier in the thick, snow-choked pine forests of Western Europe. In December 1944, Sergeant Arthur Vance was serving as a squad leader in an Army Combat Engineer Battalion during the Ardennes Offensive, the brutal conflict that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The weather during that European winter was legendary for its misery. A relentless combination of knee-deep mud, sub-zero fog, and driving snowstorms that soaked through canvas uniforms and froze soldiers in their foxholes. Arthur and his men had spent weeks freezing on the front lines, trying to warm themselves over open metal oil drums and small portable iron stoves. Those thin metal stoves were utterly useless. They burned through wood at a furious pace, blasted intense, scorching heat for 45 minutes while sending 80% of their energy straight out the metal chimney pipe, and then went completely cold the second the wood turned to ash, leaving the soldiers shivering in the dark. During a chaotic tactical retreat near the Belgian border, Arthur's exhausted, frost-bitten squad sought shelter inside an old, abandoned 18th-century stone farmhouse that stood alone on a wind-swept hill. Expecting to find the interior as freezing as the forest outside, Arthur pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into a room that completely changed his understanding of shelter. The air inside the farmhouse was warm, quiet, and wonderfully comfortable, maintaining a steady, even temperature that felt like late spring. Yet, when Arthur walked over to the center of the house to inspect the heat source, he found no roaring fire, no glowing iron stove, and no massive open fireplace dragging cold drafts through the floorboards. Instead, standing in the very heart of the building was a massive, ancient masonry stove, a cachalofin built from hundreds of pounds of thick fire brick, dense river stone, and hand-molded ceramic tiles. Arthur placed his gloved hand against the side of the massive stone heater. It was wonderfully warm to the touch, radiating a soft, steady, deep warmth that seemed to soak directly into his aching bones. The Belgian farmer, who was quietly sitting near the stove smoking a pipe, explained to the young American engineer how the ancient mechanism functioned. The farmer built only one short, intense fire inside the stove's small internal firebox every 12 hours, using nothing more than a single armful of dry hardwood branches. Because the interior of the masonry stove was built with a labyrinth of heavy, winding smoke channels, the intense 1200-degree heat generated by the fast fire did not escape up the chimney. Instead, as the hot smoke snaked its way through 18 feet of internal stone passages, the dense brick and river rock absorbed almost all of the thermal energy, trapping it inside the mass. Long after the small fire had completely burned out and the ashes had gone cold, the massive 8,000-pound stone body acted like a giant thermal battery, slowly and continuously radiating soft infrared heat into the living space for 14 straight hours. Standing in that warm Belgian farmhouse while artillery shells rumbled in the distance, Arthur examined the masonry stove with the sharp, inquisitive eyes of a trained combat engineer. He realized that traditional American building methods were fundamentally flawed because they relied entirely on active heating, the endless, wasteful burning of wood inside thin structures that bled heat continuously into the wind. The Europeans, working with centuries of resource scarcity, had mastered stored heating using heavy physical mass to capture heat energy and lock it inside the living space. Arthur looked at his shivering squad members as they finally removed their wet coats and sat comfortably on the warm stone benches built into the sides of the heater. On that frozen night in 1944, Arthur made a silent, solemn promise to himself. If he survived the war and made it back home to America, he would never subject his wife and children to a cold, drafty, heat-bleeding house. He would take the heavy, heat-storing principles of European masonry and merge them with modern American materials to create a shelter that no mountain blizzard could ever defeat. In March 1947, the opportunity Arthur Vance had been waiting for finally presented itself in the most unexpected place. Arthur received a printed notice from a fellow veteran that the United States government was liquidating massive amounts of war surplus equipment at the military supply depot just outside of Billings, Montana. Knowing that building materials were still incredibly scarce and expensive following the end of the war, Arthur hitched a heavy wooden flatbed trailer to his tired Ford truck and drove 90 miles east across the plains to attend the auction. The military supply yard was a vast ocean of olive-drab trucks, wooden crates, and stacked steel. But as Arthur walked through the rows of equipment, his eyes immediately locked onto a long pile of unassembled structural kits. They were war surplus corrugated steel Quonset arch kits, the iconic 20 by 36-foot semicircular shelters designed by engineers to be rapidly assembled in the Pacific and Arctic theaters to house troops and heavy machinery. Each kit consisted of heavy, galvanized steel ribs, arched corrugated metal skin panels, and bags of heavy steel connecting bolts. To the average rancher or farmer attending the auction, the metal arches looked like nothing more than cheap materials for building a tool shed, a grain bin, or a tractor barn. But to Arthur Vance, looking at those curved steel ribs through the eyes of a combat engineer, the Quonset kit represented something far more valuable. It was a completely airtight, rot-proof, wind-indestructible exterior weather shield. It was a structure that had no flat roof to collapse under heavy mountain snow, no square corners for wind to catch, and no log seams for drafts to penetrate. Best of all, because the government was eager to clear the yard, Arthur managed to win a complete, brand new 20 by 36-foot Quonset kit for the bargain price of $45. It took Arthur 6 exhausting hours to load the 2,200 pounds of curved steel arches, heavy iron-based plates, and corrugated metal panels onto his flatbed trailer. The truck's springs groaned under the weight, the tires bulged, and the engine strained as he began the slow, arduous 90-mile journey back toward the Beartooth Mountains. By mid-afternoon, Arthur pulled his overloaded truck and trailer into the hitching yard outside the Red Lodge General Store and Lumber Yard to buy supplies. Within minutes, a crowd of local ranchers, loggers, and townspeople gathered around the flatbed, staring at the pile of curved green steel with expressions of complete bewilderment. Stepping out from the porch of the lumber yard was Gideon Thorne. Gideon was a towering, broad-shouldered man of 64, with a weather-beaten face and hands that looked like they had been carved out of rough oak. He was the most respected master builder in the region, a man who had personally designed and constructed over 50 traditional dovetail log cabins across Carbon County over the past 3 decades. Gideon looked at the pile of metal arches on Arthur's trailer, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the slush, and let out a loud, booming laugh that brought smiles to the faces of the watching crowd. Gideon walked around the trailer, tapping his heavy knuckle against one of the corrugated steel panels with a loud, hollow metallic clang. He asked Arthur if he was planning to store his tractor inside that tin barrel, or if he was setting up a repair shop for the county road crew. When Arthur quietly replied that he was going to use the steel arch to build his family's new primary residence, the gathering crowd erupted into outright laughter. Gideon stopped laughing, his weathered face turning dead serious as he looked down at the younger veteran. He told Arthur in front of the entire town that metal was an absolute disaster for human shelter. Gideon explained the basic, unyielding laws of frontier construction that every carpenter lived by. Metal is an extreme conductor of cold. In a Montana winter, an uninsulated steel shell becomes a giant freezing plate. The warm breath from human bodies, the moisture from cooking stew, and the steam from boiling water would rise, hit that freezing metal skin, and instantly condense into sheets of dripping water. Within a month, Gideon warned, Arthur's house would become a dripping, moldy showerhead, coating his furniture in ice and rotting every piece of wood inside the structure. He declared the metal arches a livestock shelter at best and a tin coffin at worst. Arthur listened to the master builder's harsh warning with quiet respect. He did not attempt to explain his complex plans for internal heat storage, secondary inner walls, or convective air gaps. He knew that trying to explain thermodynamic physics to men who believed only in hand-hewn logs was a complete waste of breath. Arthur simply thanked Gideon for his advice, climbed back into the cab of his groaning truck, and engaged the low gear, hauling his 2,000 pounds of steel up the steep, muddy mountain trail toward his isolated claim. When the spring mud finally dried in June 1947, Arthur Vance began the exhausting physical labor of transforming his radical architectural design into physical reality. Instead of choosing a flat, exposed piece of open pasture, like most homesteaders, Arthur carefully selected a building site situated directly against a steep, south-facing slope on the northern edge of his property. Using a heavy shovel, a pickaxe, and a horse-drawn dirt scoop, he spent 3 weeks excavating deep into the hillside. He dug 4 feet into the natural earth, creating a massive, recessed bench in the slope. By nestling the back and northern sides of his future house deep inside the ground, he was utilizing the natural earth berm principle, using hundreds of tons of mountain soil to completely shield his home from the killing, frost-bearing northern winds that scoured the valley every winter. Next came the foundation. Arthur knew that the structure he was designing would carry an immense, unprecedented amount of physical weight. Using his truck, he hauled dozens of loads of heavy fieldstone and granite boulders from the nearby creek bed. He dug a 4-foot-deep, 3-foot-wide foundation trench around the entire perimeter of the excavation, extending down until he hit solid bedrock. He hand-stacked the stone footings, binding them with a thick, dense mortar mix of local clay, washed sand, and hydrated lime. Once the foundation was fully cured, Arthur erected the 20 by 36-foot corrugated steel Quonset arch, bolting the heavy galvanized metal base plates directly into the stone footings. Within 5 days, the shiny, curved steel tunnel stood complete, arching 12 feet high at its center apex. To anyone passing along the distant ridge, it looked like a simple metal storage shed nestled against the dirt hill. However, it was the interior layout, the precise, multi-layered structural envelope that made Arthur's design an absolute masterpiece of engineering. Arthur was not living inside a metal building. He was using the metal building as an outer weather umbrella to house a completely independent thermal structure built inside it. The exact architectural layering of Arthur's home was constructed with absolute precision. First, the outermost boundary consisted of the natural, earth-bermed hillside on the north and west sides, backed by the galvanized corrugated steel Quonset arch. This layer served one single purpose. It was an indestructible, completely windproof and waterproof outer weather shield designed to stop 50-mile-an-hour Arctic gales dead in their tracks. Second, positioned directly inside the steel arch, Arthur left a wide, continuous, 20-inch ventilated dead air gap. He installed small screened air intake vents near the floor level along the stone foundation, and secondary exhaust vents near the top ridge of the steel arch. This air gap acted as a thermal buffer zone and a moisture management corridor. Any humidity that managed to escape the living quarters would be carried upward by natural air currents and exhausted through the top vents, long before it could ever touch or condense on the cold steel roof. Third, built entirely inside the steel arch and separated by that 20-inch air gap, Arthur constructed the real heart of his home, a massive, load-bearing inner wall built out of 9,200 pounds of local sandstone and river granite. This stone envelope was 20 inches thick at the base, wrapping tightly around the entire interior curve of the living space to enclose a cozy 15 by 30-foot living area. Finally, to lock the steel arch into the natural mountain landscape and protect the exposed front entrance, Arthur hand-stacked a heavy decorative sandstone facade across the front south-facing wall, embedding 2 thick, double-paned wooden windows designed to capture low winter sunlight. Arthur worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, through the scorching summer months of July and August. His hands became deeply calloused, bruised, and stained with mortar. His back ached constantly from lifting thousands of pounds of rock from the creek bed, carrying them up makeshift scaffolding, and using a stone hammer and cold chisel to shape every single sandstone block so that it fit tight and square. He was doing the physical work of 5 men, working completely alone under the high mountain sun, driven by a quiet, unyielding determination to make sure his family would never freeze again. As the late summer sun began to turn the mountain grasses golden, Arthur Vance's home became the single most famous spectacle in Carbon County. Passing ranchers, timber haulers, and mountain travelers would regularly stop their wagons along the High Ridge Trail above Arthur's claim, pointing down at the hillside excavation and laughing at the strange, half-metal, half-stone creation taking shape below. Word of the Beartooth Bunker spread to every saloon, church gathering, and general store from Red Lodge to Rockvale. In mid-August, Gideon Thorne decided to ride out to the claim himself to see what the young veteran was doing. The old master builder dismounted his horse, walked through the open front frame, and stepped inside the structure. He stood on the dirt floor, staring in absolute disbelief at what Arthur was constructing. Inside the curved metal arch, Arthur had already raised the inner sandstone wall 6 feet high, carefully mortaring the dense, heavy rocks into a continuous 20-inch thick internal wall that paralleled the curved steel roof. Gideon walked up to the wall, running his hand over the damp, freshly laid lime mortar, and let out a heavy sigh of disapproval. He looked at Arthur, who was standing on a wooden staging platform mixing another batch of mortar in a wheelbarrow. Gideon shook his head and delivered a stern, authoritative lecture on building physics as he understood them. He told Arthur that stacking 9,000 pounds of raw river stone inside a building was the worst mistake a man could make. Gideon insisted that stone was a natural cold sink, a dense, lifeless material that absorbed cold from the ground and pulled thermal energy straight out of human bodies, like a sponge soaking up water. He argued that no matter how big a fire Arthur built in the center of the room, those thick stone walls would remain cold to the touch all winter long, chilling the air and creating an inescapable, damp draft that would settle right in the lungs of his young children. Furthermore, Gideon pointed to the 20-inch air gap between the stone and the steel roof, declaring that the space would act as a stagnant chimney for moisture, turning the interior into a dripping, moldy cave. The second the temperature dropped below zero, Arthur rested his mortar trowel on the edge of the barrow and listened patiently. He calmly explained the physics behind his design. He told the old master builder that stone only acts as a cold sink if it is exposed to freezing outside air and left uncharged. But when stone is housed entirely inside an insulated, windproof envelope and charged with heat from an internal source, it transforms from a cold sink into a massive thermal battery. He explained how the 20-inch air gap, far from trapping moisture, utilized the natural stack effect, pulling cool, dry air from the floor vents, warming it slightly against the stone wall, and venting any water vapor safely out through the roof vents before condensation could ever form. Gideon listened to Arthur's scientific explanation for a few moments, his face hardening into a mask of stubborn arrogance. He dismissed Arthur's talk of thermal batteries and convective air loops as fancy, useless book learning that had no place on the Montana frontier. Gideon spat on the dirt floor and declared that 60 years of practical mountain experience proved that wood was made for living and stone was made for foundations. That evening, Gideon rode back into Red Lodge and walked directly into the busy Red Lodge trading post, where dozens of local farmers and ranchers were gathering after work. In a loud, ringing voice that carried across the entire store, Gideon announced that he had just inspected Arthur Vance's stone and metal experiment. He declared the building a complete architectural disaster that would prove unlivable before the first real snowstorm of the year. To prove his point, Gideon pulled a crisp $50 bill, a massive sum of money at the time, from his leather wallet, and slapped it down on the wooden sales counter. He placed an open, public bet that Arthur Vance and his family would be forced to abandon their stone barrel and come crawling into town, begging for shelter, before the first day of January. 2 local saloon owners and a freight driver quickly added $20 each to the pot, creating a $90 wager on the failure of Arthur's home. When news of the public bet reached the homestead 2 days later, Arthur's wife, Clara, sat down at the wooden kitchen table in their old cabin, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea. She looked at Arthur with deep, quiet anxiety in her eyes and asked him if they were making a terrible mistake that would jeopardize the safety of their daughters. Arthur sat down beside her, pulled a sheet of butcher paper covered with hand-drawn structural diagrams and mathematical calculations from his coat pocket, and gently walked her through the exact physical numbers. He showed her the weight of the stone, the surface area of the walls, and the thermal calculations he had verified during his time in the Army. He looked into his wife's eyes and promised her with absolute confidence that while the rest of the valley would be shivering and burning through their timber reserves come January, their family would be sleeping in complete, effortless warmth. By late September 1947, with the inner sandstone envelope fully raised to the ceiling, Arthur Vance began constructing the most critical technical component of his entire thermal design, the central masonry heater. In a standard frontier log cabin, the heat source was almost always a traditional open fireplace or a thin cast-iron stove connected to a short, straight pipe that poked directly through the roof. While an open fireplace looked cozy, it was a thermodynamic disaster. Over 85% of the heat energy generated by the burning wood was carried directly up the vertical chimney flue and blasted out into the cold sky. Worse still, as the hot air rushed up the chimney, it created a strong negative pressure draft inside the room, pulling freezing outside air through every crack in the log walls and floorboards. Arthur's masonry heater, constructed in the exact center of his stone-enclosed living room, operated on a completely opposite mechanical concept. Arthur built the core firebox out of high-density firebrick, capable of withstanding temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But instead of connecting the firebox to a straight vertical chimney, he built an intricate, 18-foot-long internal serpentine flue system constructed inside a thick masonry column that connected directly into the 9,000-pound sandstone wall. The heat exchange process was beautifully simple and incredibly effective for a general audience to understand. When Arthur lit a fire inside the firebox, the wood burned at extremely high temperatures, reaching over 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit due to a controlled primary air intake. As the scorching hot combustion gases and smoke left the firebox, they were forced to travel through 18 feet of winding, horizontal, and vertical stone channels before they could reach the exterior roof vent. As the 1,200-degree smoke crawled through this long, twisting stone labyrinth, the dense granite and sandstone masonry surrounding the channels acts like a massive sponge, sucking the thermal energy directly out of the hot gas. By the time the exhaust smoke finally reached the top of the roof pipe and exited into the outside air, its temperature had dropped from 1,200 degrees down to a mere 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 85% of the total heat produced by the burning wood was captured, trapped, and stored inside the mass of the building, rather than being wasted into the atmosphere. Furthermore, because the fire in a masonry heater burns at such extreme, unrestricted temperatures, it achieves nearly complete combustion. Every particle of wood, fiber, gas, and volatile resin is completely consumed by the flames. This meant that the heater produced virtually zero creosote buildup inside the flue, completely eliminating the dangerous chimney fires that plagued traditional log cabin owners and produced almost no visible smoke from the exterior chimney pipe. Unlike his neighbors, who had to keep small, smoldering fires burning in their drafty fireplaces 24 hours a day, Arthur designed his heater for short, high-intensity burns. He only needed to build one fast 2-hour fire using a small armful of dry pine branches once or twice a day. During those 2 hours, the firebox generated immense heat that was instantly transferred into the surrounding masonry, fully charging his 9,000-pound thermal battery. Once the fire went out and the firebox door was tightly sealed, the masonry heater sat quietly in the center of the home, completely clean and smokeless, ready to release its massive store of trapped thermal energy into the living space over the next 12 to 16 hours. To fully appreciate the sheer brilliance of Arthur Vance's home, one must look at the exact scientific numbers that governed its performance during the autumn of 1947. The 9,200 pounds of local sandstone and granite that Arthur had hand-stacked inside the Quonset frame formed a continuous physical envelope enclosing the family's entire living quarters. In physical terms, sandstone has a specific heat capacity that allows it to store 0.22 British thermal units, BTUs, of heat energy per pound for every single degree its temperature rises. When Arthur charged his inner stone envelope with his central masonry heater, raising the core temperature of the stone walls to a warm 110 degrees Fahrenheit, the physical masonry stored over 100,000 BTUs of reserve heat energy. This created an extraordinary physical phenomenon known as radiant heat storage. In a standard house heated by a wood stove, the stove heats the surrounding air. The warm air rises to the ceiling, cold air settles at the floor, and every time someone opens the front door, the warm air instantly escapes into the night, forcing the home to cool down immediately. Radiant heat from a heavy stone mass operates in a fundamentally different way. The charged stone walls do not warm the air directly. Instead, they emit continuous, long-wave infrared energy that travels through the air without losing strength and warms solid objects, directly warming the wooden floorboards, the furniture, the inner walls, and the skin of the people sitting in the room. Walking into Arthur's stone-wrapped room felt exactly like stepping out of the shade and standing under the direct, gentle warmth of the spring sun. Even if the front door was opened wide, and all the warm air inside the room was flushed out by a gust of wind, the moment the door was closed, the room instantly felt warm again because the massive stone walls were constantly radiating energy back into the space. Equally important was Arthur's solution to the moisture problem that Gideon Thorne had insisted would ruin the building. In cold climates, indoor moisture is created by normal human activity, breathing, cooking, and boiling water. In an ordinary uninsulated metal building, warm, moisture-laden indoor air rises, hits the freezing steel skin, drops below the dew point, and instantly turns into liquid water or frost, creating massive condensation damage. Arthur's 20-inch ventilated air gap completely solved this problem through passive moisture flow. The inner stone wall was sealed on its interior face with a smooth layer of breathable lime plaster, preventing indoor moisture from penetrating the wall. Meanwhile, the 20-inch air gap between the outer steel arch and the back of the stone wall was connected to small air intake vents near the floor and large exhaust vents at the top apex of the steel arch. This configuration established a continuous, natural convection loop. A tiny fraction of the heat radiating from the outer surface of the stone wall slightly warmed the air inside the 20-inch gap. As this air warmed, it naturally rose toward the top ridge vent, creating a gentle, continuous upward chimney draft inside the gap. This rising air column pulled cool, dry air in through the floor vents, swept up any microscopic trace of moisture vapor that migrated through the materials, and carried it safely out through the top ridge vents before it could ever touch or condense on the galvanized steel roof. The inner face of the steel arch remained bone-dry, the stone masonry remained completely free of frost, and the air inside the living space maintained a perfect, healthy, relative humidity of 40% all winter long. Arthur had successfully built a self-regulating, passive climate control structure that required zero electricity, zero mechanical fans, and zero fossil fuels to operate seamlessly. The winter test that would decide the fate of Arthur Vance's family and settle the public bet of Carbon County arrived with sudden, terrifying violence during the first week of January 1948. On the morning of January 8, the barometer reading across southern Montana began a precipitous, unnatural drop. The clear blue winter sky turned a dull, bruised slate gray, and the wind, which had been blowing gently out of the west, suddenly went completely dead calm. Veteran mountain ranchers who had lived in the region for decades recognized the ominous signs immediately. A massive, deep Arctic air mass, a polar vortex plunging straight down out of the Canadian Northwest Territories, was spilling over the Rocky Mountain front and surging into the Beartooth Valley. By mid-afternoon, the temperature began a terrifying slide. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the thermometer hanging outside the Red Lodge General Store read 15 degrees above zero. By 6 o'clock at sunset, it had dropped to 5 below zero. By midnight, it had plummeted to 18 below. And by 7 o'clock on the morning of January 9, the mercury column had retreated to a staggering 32 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, negative 35.5 degrees Celsius. Accompanying this extreme cold was a screaming 50-mile-an-hour gale that tore down off the Beartooth Plateau, picking up the dry, powdery snowpack and driving it horizontally across the valley in a blinding, deafening whiteout. The official wind chill temperature plunged to an astonishing 65 degrees below zero. It was the kind of killing cold that turns diesel fuel into thick jelly, splits green timber open with loud booming cracks, and causes exposed human flesh to freeze solid in under 90 seconds. The entire valley was plunged into an immediate, life-threatening crisis. Roads were completely drifted shut under 6-foot snowdrifts, cutting off all communication between homesteads and town. Water mains in Red Lodge froze solid and burst under the streets. Ranchers fought desperately to save their livestock, but the cold was too severe. Dozens of cattle and horses, trapped in open pastures or thin three-sided sheds, froze to death where they stood, their breath turning to ice icicles over their nostrils. The disaster at the homestead of Harlan Miller Arthur's nearest neighbor, who lived a mile down the valley in a traditional, master-built log cabin, was typical of the suffering experienced across the region. Harlan's log cabin, built 5 years earlier with thick timber and heavy clay chinking, was completely overwhelmed by the Arctic gale. The screaming wind hit the north log wall with tremendous force, stripping away heat instantly and pushing freezing air through microscopic cracks in the dried chinking. Within hours, the interior of Harlan's cabin became a freezing nightmare. Harlan, his wife, and their 3 young children were forced to abandon the bedrooms entirely and move their mattresses into the main room, arranging them in a tight circle directly around their heavy cast-iron wood stove. Harlan ran the iron stove red-hot, stoking it with heavy split logs every 45 minutes throughout the night. Yet, despite the iron stove glowing bright orange and consuming wood at a terrifying rate, the cabin's interior air temperature 5 feet away from the fire sat at a miserable 12 degrees above zero. Water buckets sitting on the kitchen counter froze solid. The draft blowing across the floorboards was so freezing that a cup of warm tea set down near the bed would form a film of ice within 10 minutes. Thick, opaque sheets of white ice coated the interior faces of the spruce logs, and the family sat huddled beneath 5 layers of wool blankets, wearing their heavy winter coats, fur hats, and thick boots inside their own home, listening to the wind howl, and wondering how many days their rapidly dwindling firewood pile would last. On the 14th of January 1948, the 6th continuous day of the historic Arctic deep freeze, the storm reached its absolute peak. The outside temperature hovered at 32 below zero, and the winds scoured the valley with relentless, deafening fury. All across Carbon County, frontier families were living in a state of sheer, desperate endurance. At Harlan Miller's place, the family had completely burned through their outdoor cordwood stack and were forced to begin chopping up their wooden dining chairs, extra bed frames, and cedar fence posts just to keep a flame alive in their iron stove. Harlan was exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from waking up every 90 minutes to tend the fire, his hands cracked and bleeding from handling frozen wood in the dark. His house was a drafty, smoke-filled icebox where life had been reduced to a primitive struggle against freezing to death. And yet, just 1 mile up the trail, inside Arthur Vance's stone-wrapped Quonset shelter, an entirely different world existed. Inside the Vance home, the scene was so remarkably comfortable that it defied every rule of frontier life. The fire inside the central masonry heater had been completely out for 7 straight hours, having burned down to cool gray ash at 8 o'clock the previous evening. Yet, the thermometer mounted on the inner sandstone wall read a rock-steady, uniform 69 degrees Fahrenheit, 20.5 degrees Celsius. The heavy stone floor, warmed from below by the Earth's natural thermal mass and surrounded by the 9,000-pound stone wall, sat at a comfortable 62 degrees. There were no drafts, no cold spots, and no temperature swings. The continuous infrared energy radiating from the sandstone envelope kept every corner of the 15 by 30-foot living space at the exact same comfortable warmth. The visual contrast inside the house was absolute proof of Arthur's engineering triumph. Arthur was sitting at his wooden workbench near the back wall, comfortably working on a leather harness, wearing nothing more than a light flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His wife, Clara, was standing near the kitchen counter humming quietly as she cooked a pot of beef stew on the cast-iron cooktop, wearing a simple cotton house dress without a sweater or shawl. Their 2 young daughters, Evelyn and Nora, were sitting barefoot on a braided rag rug in the center of the room, playing a board game in light summer cotton dresses, completely oblivious to the killing 60-below wind-chill blizzard that was roaring over the steel roof overhead. Arthur walked over to the small south-facing window. He looked through the crystal-clear, double-paned glass, which showed not a single trace of interior frost, ice, or condensation, and watched the blinding white snowstorm scour the distant pines. He then walked into the 20-inch air-gap corridor between the inner stone wall and the outer steel Quonset shell to conduct a thorough inspection. He carried a flashlight and checked the back face of the galvanized metal arch. The steel was freezing cold to the touch, but it was completely, remarkably dry. The small floor intake vents and ridge exhaust vents were functioning with absolute perfection, establishing a subtle, continuous airflow that swept away every trace of moisture vapor before it could ever accumulate. There was no water running down the walls, no mold forming on the mortar, and no ice building up inside the structure. Arthur's family had used less than 3/4 of a cord of wood since the beginning of December. While his neighbors were burning through hundreds of pounds of timber every week and destroying their own furniture to stay alive, Arthur's small stack of dry pine branches stored in the corner was more than enough to keep his home at 69 degrees for the remainder of the winter. His crazy architectural experiment had not merely worked. It had created a comfortable, effortless, self-sustaining sanctuary in the middle of the deadliest storm in Montana history. On the morning of the 16th of January 1948, the fierce blizzard winds finally subsided, leaving behind a silent, snow-choked landscape under a brilliant, cold blue sky. Traveling slowly up the valley on heavy wooden snowshoes was Lyle Montgomery. Lyle was the official Carbon County surveyor and a certified weather observer for the United States Climate Bureau. He was a highly educated, methodical man who carried a specialized wooden instrument case containing 2 laboratory-calibrated mercury thermometers. Lyle had been tasked by the county authorities with checking on isolated homesteads to log storm damage and verify temperature extremes. Lyle turned up the mountain trail toward Arthur Vance's claim, fully expecting to find a tragic situation. He had heard about the crazy veteran who had buried a metal Quonset hut in the hillside, and like everyone else, he assumed the structure had either collapsed under the massive 4-foot snowdrifts or turned into an uninhabitable block of ice. When Lyle reached the clearing, he was astonished to see the steel arch sitting sound and secure beneath the snowpack, its front sandstone facade completely undamaged. He walked up to the front entrance and knocked on the heavy wooden door. The door swung open, and Lyle Montgomery was instantly struck by a wall of soft, luxurious warmth that made him pause in absolute astonishment. Arthur invited the surveyor inside. Lyle stepped across the threshold, blinked his eyes in disbelief, and stood frozen in the center of the room. He watched Arthur's 2 young daughters running across the warm stone floor in light cotton dresses, laughing and playing with a wooden toy. Lyle instinctively reached up and unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, pulling off his fur hat as his face began to flush from the comfortable, tropical air. Without saying a word, Lyle opened his wooden case, pulled out his calibrated mercury thermometer, and hung it from a bracket in the center of the living room. He waited 15 minutes for the mercury to settle, then stepped closer to read the glass column. The exterior air temperature read 28 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, negative 33.3 degrees Celsius. The interior center room temperature read 69 degrees Fahrenheit, 20.5 degrees Celsius. The interior floor level temperature read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The far bedroom wall temperature read 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Lyle calculated the mathematical difference, a staggering 101 degree Fahrenheit temperature delta between the outside Arctic gale and the inside living space. Lyle walked over to the central masonry heater to inspect the firebox. He opened the iron door and looked inside, expecting to see a roaring bed of coals. Instead, he found nothing but cold, dark gray ash. He reached in with his bare hand and touched the bottom grate. It was completely cold. The fire had been dead for over 8 hours. Yet the massive sandstone wall surrounding the room was still radiating steady, gentle warmth into his palm. Lyle pulled out his official survey ledger and began writing down the extraordinary numbers. He had spent the previous afternoon inspecting 6 conventional log cabins in the valley, including Harlan Miller's home and Gideon Thorne's master-built cabin. His official measurements recorded that Harlan's cabin sat at 42 degrees near the hearth and 12 degrees near the back wall while burning over 200 pounds of wood a day. Gideon's famous log home was maintaining 48 degrees while consuming a cord of wood every 9 days. Arthur Vance was maintaining 69 degrees across his entire home on less than 20 pounds of wood a day. As Lyle was finishing his notes, the heavy front door opened again, and a tall figure stepped into the entryway, accompanied by a swirl of cold air. It was Gideon Thorne. The 64-year-old master builder had trudged 2 miles through the deep snow drifts on snowshoes, driven by an overwhelming need to see the fate of Arthur's home with his own eyes and settle the public bet he had placed 5 months earlier. Gideon stepped into the warm room, his heavy fur coat dusted with snow. He stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at Arthur standing in his light flannel shirt, looked at the young girls playing on the floor, and felt the deep, all-encompassing, radiant warmth that enveloped his frozen body. Gideon did not speak. He slowly unbuttoned his heavy coat, let it slide off his shoulders, and dropped it onto a wooden chair. He walked slowly across the room toward the central stone wall, his heavy boots echoing on the clean floorboards. He stopped in front of the masonry heater, reached out his thick, weather-beaten, calloused hand, and placed his bare palm flat against the sandstone surface. He held his hand there for a long time, feeling the deep, steady infrared warmth vibrating out of the 9,000-pound stone mass heat that had been captured from a small fire hours ago and was now gently warming the entire house. Gideon closed his eyes, let out a long, slow breath, and bowed his head. The proud old builder, who had spent 40 years believing that traditional hand-cut logs were the pinnacle of mountain shelter, realized in a single moment that his pride had blinded him to the elegant laws of nature. He reached into his inner breast pocket, pulled out his leather wallet, and extracted the $50 bill he had placed on the counter at the general store. He stepped over to the table, laid the bill down beside Arthur's engineering sketches, and looked the young veteran straight in the eye. Gideon's voice was quiet, thick with emotion, but completely clear as he spoke to Arthur in front of the county surveyor. I spent 30 years building houses that bled heat and made families suffer through every winter. You built a home that holds warmth and protects your children. I was wrong, Artie. You built the smartest house in this valley. The spring of 1948 brought a quiet, profound revolution to Carbon County, rooted not in pride or defeat, but in unity, learning, and mutual respect. Arthur Vance did not gloat over his victory or mock the men who had doubted him. Instead, he opened his doors to every rancher, logger, and carpenter in the region. He spent his evenings sitting at his wooden kitchen table with Gideon Thorne by his side, freely sharing his hand-drawn butcher paper blueprints, mathematical calculations, and masonry designs with anyone who wanted to learn. Gideon became Arthur's greatest champion, using his master carpentry skills to partner with the young engineer, and together they helped 14 local families excavate hillsides, erect protective outer shells, and build heavy inner stone thermal mass envelopes before the arrival of the next winter. The human impact of this transformation was immediate, deep, and life-changing across the entire valley. Children who had spent previous winters shivering under piles of coats and coughing through smoke-filled nights now slept peacefully in warm, draft-free bedrooms, while family timber consumption across the region dropped by over 70%, freeing homesteaders from the exhausting, back-breaking labor of endless woodcutting. The local community learned a timeless frontier lesson that true strength and resilience did not mean silently enduring unnecessary suffering through outdated habits, but having the courage to honor natural physical laws, embrace quiet observation, and replace old traditions with smarter, more compassionate solutions. Decades later, long after the original homesteaders had passed on, Arthur Vance's stone-wrapped shelter still stands firm against the sweeping winds of the Beartooth Range, its heavy sandstone walls completely intact and its quiet masonry core holding warm history inside its mass. It remains a silent, inspiring monument to practical human ingenuity over arrogant opinion, proof that when the coldest storms of life test us, the smartest and most enduring solutions do not come from brute force, expensive tradition, or noisy confidence, but from quiet wisdom, deep observation, and the simple refusal to freeze. This story presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized drama based on documented historical building techniques, while the structural concepts, thermodynamic principles, and thermal mass physics discussed reflect real, well-established practical knowledge used in passive solar and masonry architecture. Any modern structural application should always be evaluated according to current local building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content is intended for educational storytelling and does not constitute professional engineering or legal advice.